the Paris Agreement is dead. Global warming is going to significantly exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius. There's no credible route in which we're going to lower temperatures. And so unless we rapidly phase out coal, oil and gas, and not to mention begin the hard work of reforming global food production systems, we're in a tremendous amount of danger.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is James Dyke. James is an Earth system scientist, and this is his second time on Planet Critical. I first met James interviewing him about 3 years ago on the fallacy of net zero. It was my first introduction as to how the vast majority of climate policy around the world was nothing more than accounting tricks and moving numbers around on paper. During that episode, the goal of keeping the Earth's temperature to an additional 1.5 degrees Celsius was still viable. There was still action that we could take, steps we could take, policies that we could implement, which would have kept 1.5 alive. This is no longer the case. James is back on this show to explain how the majority of climate policy has resulted in a world that is now past 1.5. He begins by explaining how excess heating is created through entropy and how systems normally interact to create useful work out of entropy, and how the problem with the Anthropocene is that humans have put too much CO2, i.e. entropy, into the atmosphere, more than the Earth can recycle. James then goes on to explain how the discussions of policies like carbon dioxide removal technology are time machines, that a huge amount of money and investment and effort is being invested into these techno-solutions, which have yet to be proven scientifically, which simply cannot scale up to the extent that we would need, but which allow and perpetuate the existing system, not only by promising some future in which we will undo all of the damage that we have caused, but by also facilitating continuing pollution of the Earth until that aforementioned future. James then explains that it is now time to take a hold of the narrative. Every fraction of a degree counts. If we don't set new targets and if we don't have realistic discussions about how climate policy has failed us, then it is likely the fossil fuel industry will step in with a narrative that benefits the continued extraction and production of fossil fuels. We then talk about what a just transition would look like and how to finance that transition. We talk about the history of climate policies that have typically failed due to the perverse incentives that almost always arise out of capitalism. He hammers on the point that we need to focus on the cause, not the systems, and that is stopping our use of fossil fuels. And we then end on a discussion about collapse. Will the world as we know it end? What will it look like? What are the signals in science that point to different futures? And how do the different attitudes towards collapse sometimes facilitate the continued destructive action driving us over the cliff? I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week. James, thank you so much for coming back on Planet Critical. Welcome to the show. How you been?
I've been good, and it's nice to know that you've not become too famous to want me back on.
Now, I'm so excited that we're having this conversation again, because I vividly remember our first conversation, which I'll link in the show notes, in which you explained sort of the fallacy of net zero. And I must have been about 3 years ago, and it totally blew my mind. Thankfully, I've learned a little bit along the way, so now I would just nod in cynical agreement. But it was astonishing.
Well, I mean, thanks, but that was an article that I wrote with Bob Watson and Wolfgang Knorr, and I did a lot of work with them, and I continue to do quite a bit of work with them, actually.
Well, that's what we're going to discuss today, I believe. Now, before we do that, you get the first question, which is new. I didn't ask you this last time. Why is the world in crisis?
Aha. You didn't ask me, but I listened to the show. So I've been thinking about this question and I've got a one-word answer, which is entropy. And I can unpack it very briefly.
Oh, one word answer. That is, you've just set the bar really high. Nobody's given a one word answer before.
Oh, cool. All right. Yeah.
Yeah. Unpack it. What is entropy?
Well, the good thing about entropy is that, most of us don't really know what it means.
I was about to say.
Quite cool. So, oh yeah. But you don't say that. You kind of nod. Yeah. But I'm using in the context of all living things produce entropic waste, right? So one of the conundrums about living things were, if you understand thermodynamics, everything must, things run down, things become more disordered. So how do you get the spontaneous emergence of complicated ordered things in the universe like life? Well, it's because they export energy, So Descartes might have said, I think, therefore I am, but more fundamentally, I live, therefore I shit, right? And shit is entropic waste. You take ordered things, you produce waste, and over that gradient, you can do work to create an ordered body, your organs, your organelles, stuff like that. And we can look at our civilization like that and human societies like that. It is a biological phenomena. And as it's been getting bigger and bigger and getting access to more energy and more materials, it's been literally building the built environment, billions and billions of tons of concrete and steel. And that comes an unavoidable production of entropic waste. And the one that everybody knows about at the moment is carbon dioxide, right? So that's that's kind of the fundamental reason why we're producing planetary scale impacts to the extent that it's now beginning to affect us. But there's also another cute way of thinking about entropy, which is about how you can imagine disorder, so when Humpty Dumpty fell off the wall, right, and they couldn't put him back together, right, it's because entropy is a kind of a real good measure of the irreversibility of the physical universe, and when we're hearing about narratives of climate overshoot, we can overshoot any amount of warming, but don't worry, we'll just drag temperatures back down by we're taking all that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. If you think about the concept of entropy, that represents a really big problem because you're taking concentrated carbon in the form of coal, oil, gas, and then you're burning it and to generate energy, and those carbon atoms then get distributed in terms of parts per million. And to get all that back, to reverse that kind of entropic flow, is going to require enormous amounts of energy. If you look at some assessments of how much electricity direct air capture is going to be consuming by the middle of this century, 25% of global electricity. It's just completely bonkers, right? Because the old adage applies, it's better to not make the mess than to try to clean it up later. And entropy is a cute way of thinking about that, kind of from an information point of view and a kind of an energetics point of view, but arguably more importantly, just like a common sense point of view.
Yes, so much of this grand, complex problem always seems to come down to common sense. And yet people in charge seem incapable of deploying it, which is the paradox I would like to study personally. Explain a little bit more to me. Let's stick on this. Explain a little bit more to me how it is that within certain systems, like the Earth system before we started putting loads and loads of extra carbon dioxide and methane and everything else into the atmosphere, before the human system radically increased its amount of entropic waste. How was it that systems were managing to, how do I put this, keep entropic waste within a certain gradient that was useful work and didn't over pollute essentially?
Yeah, that's a really cool way of thinking about it. I guess the short answer is through energy material recycling, right? So the biosphere has evolved. I don't mean to evoke a sense of purpose or direction on the biosphere, although some people do, right? But it has evolved over time, and we're talking billions of years, to highly conserve things that life wants, limiting nutrients like phosphorus or nitrogen or other bits and pieces, which are essentially in rocks, right? Which get liberated by life, and life has evolved ways to get access to those limiting nutrients. So lichens can secrete kind of acids to dissolve rock, which grabs hold of these limiting nutrients, and then things eat the lichen, and the thing that eats the lichen gets eaten and eaten and eaten. And that goes round and round, which we learn at school with, never a food chain, it's a food web, right? Now, eventually, let's say that lichen was liberating an atom of phosphorus that goes round and round and round, tens, hundreds of times, until eventually it ends up in the sea, and it goes round and round and round tens of times in marine ecosystems, but then will eventually end up dropping out of a marine ecosystem and falling to the bottom of the sea floor, right? Even then, there's a little bit of recycling. So whenever you see those submarines that go right down to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, are these weird fucking things with, nightmarish creatures, which are still, they're eating on the products of the kind of the detritus that rains down from the photic zone of the sea. But even then, eventually gets covered with silt and mud, and it becomes rock, and it goes back into the Earth's interior, and then maybe 10, 20 million years later, it comes back up again or something. Oh. So it's the story of life on Earth is one of a co-evolution where life emerges, dissipates some kind of energy gradient, the biggest one being the evolution of photosynthesis, because it can gain access to the tremendous power of the sun to split molecules and do work. And that produces entropic waste. But then that entropic waste generates other cycles, which other organisms can either liberate or use, or in some instances that becomes their literal ecological niche. And through this kind of complex rewiring and reformatting, you end up with periods of, yes, stability, like tremendous kind of remarkable stability with regards to, let's say, global temperatures over billions of years, but punctuated by really violent periods of change when either something exterior happens, like an asteroid smashes into the Earth or something, or internally or endogenously, life evolves some kind of novel mechanism of generating or accessing energy, which one of the big ones would have been oxygenic photosynthesis, which produced oxygen as a byproduct, which totally rewired the biosphere. And now what you're looking at, what humans are doing, we have gained access to a tremendous amount of energy, which is stored sunlight, which is in the form of fossil fuels. And we've used that to completely rewire biogeochemical cycles. And I suppose the question now is, will that be the precursor to the next evolution, which is a form of photosynthesis, kind of using solar panels and stuff, or something else, where something else could be an awful lot worse?
Well, we'll get onto that something else if we have time at the end. That something else is covered a lot on the show, and I'd quite like to get your opinion on it if we have time. I just want to attempt to summarize that in sort of play school language. So is that kind of like saying one thing's waste is another thing's meal? And
oh yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Right. So you keep putting it through and through and through, and eventually that kind of the entropy will be dissipated. Like it's not concentrated in one part of the system.
Yeah, so, energy is never created or destroyed. It's just changed. Yeah. And there's a way you can measure the usefulness or the quality of energy, which is exergy, right? So like a liter of petrol has got tremendous amounts of exergy. You can produce tremendous amounts of work from it. A lot of power comes out of that. But it dissipates, right? Now, in some instances, you can. A good example is like an air source heat pump or ground source heat pump. The energy's there, and if you're smart enough, you can run a system whereby you can kind of harvest that energy and concentrate it and get it to do useful work, which in this instance would be making your house warmer than it would be otherwise. So you have to put some energy in, but you're really using it to kind of concentrate lower grade energy. And ultimately, because the Earth is, or the biosphere is almost entirely powered by the sun, that flux of energy is the long wave radiation back out into space, right? So over sufficiently long timescales, the energy in equals the energy out, and everything's in balance.
And what we have done is produce a huge amount of entropy, namely CO2, and pump that into the atmosphere. And the Earth has been unable to recycle most of it back into its systems, and now we've been tipped out of balance. The good news is that if we stop burning all fossil fuels tomorrow, that the Earth system would naturally recycle all that extra carbon in the atmosphere. Okay. It would just take it down. There's like chemical weathering processes, and the bad news is it would take about 100,000 years. Wow.
Because what we've done, we produce like a pulse. It's like a massive volcanic eruption, right? It's a sudden injection of 2.5 trillion tons of carbon dioxide. And the Earth has taken up about half of that, right? So of all the carbon that we put in the atmosphere, about half has been taken up by sinks, natural land sinks, and natural ocean sinks. And if we wait long enough, then they'll mop up the rest. Yeah. So it's the question of like the rate of change, the pace of change. If we'd have been slowly, putting out carbon over a much, much longer timescale, then concentrations wouldn't be anything like as high as they are now, which is where most of the heating is coming from. It's changing the energy balance. Less energy is leaving because we've got a thicker blanket over the planet, and so temperatures are going.
When you were talking about DAC, direct air capture, this techno-solutionism that there are machines that can pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. For some reason, trees have not been, identified as the pre-existing technology. But no, it's these really, really high capital investment, high energy investment machines that people are looking at. And we could draw it back. When you were discussing it, in the sense of pulling back entropy, it sounded like a time machine.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly what it is. So David Ho, he's a geologist, and he does a lot of work on mainly ocean-based carbon sinks. And he wrote a lovely kind of editorial in which he described carbon dioxide removal as essentially a time machine. And that completely, that hits the nail on the head, because that's why these technologies were proposed. They're not invented because most of them don't really exist. But the very idea of us being able to, well, if we put carbon in the atmosphere, then we can just take it out. And if you do that, then what you can do is you can completely change your kind of climate policy timescales. Right? If you want to limit warming to no more than 1.5, then you'd have to decarbonize this, because that's how much carbon you can put. Yeah, but if you can take it out, well, then you've just really, this becomes a movable target now. So what happens is this thing gets determined by the politics, what's considered to be politically feasible. And then that feeds into the climate policy. And the outcome of that is, okay, so we'll have 10 gigatons a year, please. And it's like, okay, no one's got any idea how to do that. And about the first point around trees, I mean, trees are still responsible. So if you look at the amount of carbon dioxide that is removed each year, if you look at the various reports, 99 point something percent are trees, basically. Right. The stuff which is getting a lot of interest and funding, it's a tiny fraction, maybe hundreds of tons, maybe thousands of tons a year.
It's one of those really frustrating realities that we live in, that if we were to go on a tree planting spree, which could create a number of jobs in the green economy all around the world, or certainly in ecosystems that typically have been used to having trees. We could cool cities, we could cool homes, we could, pull some extra CO2 out of the air. They could be fruit trees, some of them. They could be supplying people on the street. Well, I mean, why not, right? You see these sort of like madnesses, like the streets of Athens are lined with fruit trees of inedible fruit. You cannot eat that fruit for some reason. Occasionally a child will try, and you will never see a more grimaced face in your life. Like the stuff is absolutely rotten and disgusting. And yet, rather than doing that, we are investing in these, money is being invested into these huge technologies, which typically have ties to political parties or political party networks that demand huge upfront costs, and whose, as you're saying, tech has not yet been proven, but are being touted as this like political solution, which allows us to keep polluting the planet.
Well, one of the problems with trees is they burn down. So in terms of, there's lots of good reasons why we need more trees. If you look at, so this is pre-industrial, but if you look at the impacts that humans have had since civilization, and probably before that, since our migration out of Africa, the world has got something like 3 trillion fewer trees or something. We've destroyed vast tracts of the Earth's surface. Most of the Earth's ice-free land surface has been affected by us in some way, and a lot of that's through agriculture and it's through chopping down trees. So the Earth needs an awful lot of trees, right? But what it needs more is an awful lot of forests, and you can't plant forests. So this goes back to the timescale issue. The kind of climate solutions or carbon removal solutions that rely on trees a lot, things like BECCS, bioenergy carbon capture, they require vast numbers of trees to be planted, like huge monocultures, fast-growing non-native species that are not forests. They're not biodiverse. They could threaten food and water security of people. They're probably going to displace people, and you would never want to, why would you want to do that? Well, the reason you want to do that is because you want to get as many trees in the ground as quickly as possible so they can move the needle on concentrations of CO2.
Yeah.
If you've got more broader appreciation of what trees and forests can do, then you would be thinking about, integrating them into the urban environment and doing your best to protect the existing ones and then reforesting the ones that we've destroyed.
Yeah.
There's no end of opportunities to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get on to 1.5 and net zero. So I think to begin, I'd love your elevator pitch for why net zero is nonsense. We can swap elevator pitches. And then where are we with 1.5? Because when we last spoke, the whole interview is really, really interesting. But the big thing that jumped out to me was every fraction of a degree counts. So the fact that we have 1.5 and then 2, and this idea that if we kind of go over 1.5, well, then we'll just aim for 2 is madness to begin with. But back then, there was still this, hope at least that we could maybe, just maybe, we could hit 1.5. Where are we now?
Yep. 1.5 is still a lie. You hear that, right? Well, look, in my opinion, the Paris Agreement is dead. Global warming is going to significantly exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius. There's no credible route in which we're going to lower temperatures. And so unless we rapidly phase out coal, oil and gas, and not to mention begin the hard work of reforming global food production systems, we're in a tremendous amount of danger. And I think it's fair to say that we are almost every day, we are better understanding just how much danger that we're in. 1.5 back in Paris, the Paris Accords, it was almost an act of largesse from the rich global north, right? In response to the low-lying island nations, we'll give you 1.5, right? Because obviously above 1.5, just sea level rise alone would mean these places don't exist. But now there is, I think, a dawning realization that actually 1.5 could represent, in some instances, maybe even existential level risk for some nation states that thought themselves largely insulated or protected from climate change. So that's my pithy summary of 1.5. And one of my frustrations has been that there's been such resistance and reticence to talk about the fact that the Paris Agreement is failing, has failed, for lots of reasons that I can understand, because you assemble a coalition of willing, you get industry involvement and government involvement and declarations of climate emergency, and there was this period of 2018 with Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for Future, and, it's happening, something's happening, the social movement is happening. And the response to that was essentially net zero. And that net zero was meant to be like the on-ramp for the Paris Agreement, because the rich nations, certainly the United States, would never have agreed to something like well below 2 degrees C without the wriggle room that the Paris Agreement gives. And most people are very surprised to learn just how much wriggle room there is in the Paris Agreement, right? All built around net zero and sources and sinks of carbon. But the sugar rush of net zero is off now, right? We're now, according to Berkeley data set, we're well above 1.5, like 1.6. Mm-hmm. People are becoming increasingly concerned around the temperature anomalies that we've seen over the last 18 months. Global warming is probably accelerating for reasons that we've always known about, but there could be some reasons that we don't know about. There's increasing evidence that some carbon land sinks are beginning to fail, which are potentially catastrophic for our efforts to, remove carbon and bring temperatures back down. And so, the tide's gone out, and you can see who was or who was not wearing a bathing suit. And pretty much nobody was. It was all a bunch of promises and platitudes, I'm afraid, around 1.5, whereas no one anywhere really has done anything remotely compatible with that target.
Well, I suppose it depends how you look at the target. A huge amount of research was funded about, how you can decouple our economies from our emissions. And so much research was funded towards drafting policy around all of that they really forced to make it make sense. As if my elevator pitch for net zero is physics doesn't fall for accounting tricks.
Mm-hmm.
You can balance the books on papers, but when you are still putting CO2 out into the atmosphere, there is still going to be a warming effect. And every single ton at this stage counts, even if you are drawing down or even if you manage to draw down in the future because it stays around in the atmosphere for so long.
Mm-hmm.
So you said that something that's been surprising or disappointing is that there's an unwillingness to talk about it. We need to, how do I put this? We need to get the jump on having that conversation so that we can frame that conversation. So it doesn't just become, well,
yes,
let's aim for 2 then.
Yes, right? Yes. When we published that net zero article, somebody contacted me, they phoned me and said, you need to say something, as much as anyone's going to listen to me. But it was at UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, kind of under the auspices that run these kind of conference of the parties type thing. And there's a bunch of oil producing nation states saying that scientists say we're going to exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius because net zero doesn't work, right? So what we should do is we should fall back to 2.5 because when you look at the and a whole bunch of reasons.
My God.
But the hook was scientists say this impossible, right? For reasons. And therefore what we need to do is this, and this is entirely predicted. And I've had multiple conversations, certainly long before we published that article, right? And to characterize these conversations, or even to just summarize them, they kind of go, look, we've really got to get on the front foot, because if we don't come up with a narrative post 1.5, like they will, and we're not going to like it. Mm-hmm. And the response always is, well, of course we're going to go beyond 1.5, of course, but we can't say that yet. Right. At the moment, there's this fragile coalition that we've kind of, it's a stretch goal. It's increasing ambition. It's accelerating action. It's, if you take it away, then it's going to be counterproductive or destructive. Right. So, but then there was so when is yet? When the global average temperature is at 1.6 degrees Celsius and the weather's going bananas, right? I just don't think people are going to believe you when you say 1.5 is still alive, right? Not to mention there's going to be a whole bunch of other people saying, well, there you go. It was never going to work. We tried. The best thing to do would maybe look at 2 or something.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, in that space, there is, every fraction of a degree matters, right? And I think that starts with an acknowledgement that we've been talking about dangerous climate change for years. I gave, it's the start of term this week for me. And I give a module, it's called Global Challenges. And I realized that I first gave that particular module about 12 years ago now, right? And 12 years ago, maybe you could have, with a fair wind and, being really optimistic, you can imagine that this might have happened and that might have happened, right? But it didn't, right? It didn't. And dangerous climate change is here. We've been talking about it for decades. Hansen in 1988 was talking about dangerous interference with the climate system. We are now in a world which is dangerous. People are suffering. Some people are dead because of dangerous climate interference. And so until we can come up with a narrative that is at least honest about that and say, and this is where we need to start from in terms of the rapid decarbonisation, adaptation and loss and damages, then I think you're just completely ceding that message space to people who've got no interest in decarb.
What about that word decarbonising though? I struggle with it because I feel like it's a really great buzzword. It's a really great word for communicating in an instant, the difference, say, between like fossil fuels and renewables, but it's not entirely correct. And also it keeps this focus on carbon being the problem rather than this like systemic cascading interplay of events and relationships that include power, that include politics, that include our economies, and that include also our materials use. And also it hasn't worked, right? Like the whole rapid decarbonization in order to get 1.5, it's a message that didn't work because of all of those aforementioned sort of invisible players. So what is the messaging that we need now so as to not be hijacked and to not be pushed into a world where 2.5 becomes the next goal? What way do we need to reframe it to really make it make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of decarbonizing because it can be used, I mean, just like net zero is a pretty slippery concept. I mean, you know, these are not original ideas, but leave fossil fuels in the ground. The only way that we can be sure we don't put the carbon in the atmosphere is to not extract them in the first place. So these ideas of clean coal and carbon capture.
I'm sorry, what?
Clean coal, right? In the 90s. It was a thing, right? It was a thing, right? It was like, don't, you know, like around I mean, this is before and after Kyoto, particularly after, we've got to really stop putting carbon dioxide. And when you look around then, certainly like the United States, where's most of it coming from? And even the United Kingdom, most of it's through the burning of coal to generate electricity. So one interpretation is, why don't we stop doing that, right? Why don't we stop burning the coal? And so what the coal lobby did is said, no, what we'll do is we will capture the carbon from the chimney, right? Capture the carbon and then store it, pipe it somewhere and store it underground, right? And they called it clean coal. And of course it never worked because it just makes burning coal more expensive, yeah? But exactly the same reasoning and motivation is being used today, right? I think early this week, I signed a letter asking for Ed Miliband to basically pull out £1 billion of funding on carbon capture and storage. There's this idea that we're going to have industrial carbon capture and storage hubs, right? There's one proposed in the Solent, near Southampton. There's a very large Exxon refinery and they want to produce hydrogen from natural gas.
Oh, yeah.
That's why, you know, the energy majors love hydrogen because they got to do something with this gas, right? And that becomes carbon neutral if you capture the gas, you capture the carbon dioxide that gets created as a consequence of making that hydrogen, and then they would need to store it, you know, somewhere under the sea and the Solent and stuff. It's exactly the same argument, right? And you look at these things, it's like the same person, they just put on like a moustache or a different hat, right? It doesn't make any sense. It didn't make any sense with coal, and it doesn't make any sense now. I mean, in terms of energetics or economics, right? But it's just like another techno fix that you can use just to further motivate your continued use of fossil fuels. And the reason you want to do that is because it makes you tremendous amounts of money, or it's just built in a world system which is evolved to depend on these kind of these energy systems.
Let's take power, and when I say power, I mean political power, out of the equation, which does seem to be the main reason why certain things are not happening, even though they make sense. Like there was that great book, The Price is Right, that showed how, you know, renewable energy is the cheapest form of energy to deploy, but it's just not getting investment because the returns aren't the same as the returns that you can expect from fossil fuels. So taking centralized power out of the equation, which is doing everything to even wasting billions of dollars on things that won't work just to continue finding an excuse in order to pull these fossil fuels out of the ground. What does an actual transition look like in a way in which people don't get left behind and people don't get hurt? Because one of the arguments against stopping oil tomorrow, for example, is, you know, it's a huge source of fertilizer for our food systems. There are countries that are very much, I don't like using this word, but for want of a better word, developing still, that depend on, you know, diesel generators and essentially old school fossil fuel infrastructure. If they want to miss or bypass the fossil fuel industrial revolution, and if we want to stop putting carbon out into the atmosphere, how do we stop using fossil fuels tomorrow in a way that still allows for the cascading positive impacts of development and financial redistribution? And the money for renewable energy.
Yeah. So, I mean, about the money can be found,
Okay.
right? I mean, it's fiat money. It's pretend money. You literally just make this shit up, right? I'm sure it's a bit more complicated than that, but if a central bank or a government wants to make money, there's not a money tree somewhere, but was it M40 or something in the UK? I don't know, right? It's a bit more complicated.
Just print it.
Right. What you can't do is just magic up the work, the physical ability to build things and move things around. That's your limit, your physical limit. So that's like a ceiling. And then underneath that, there's going to be limits of how fast can societies change or political systems change. I guess there are. I suspect they can change an awful lot faster than many people think, right? But as you say, we can't just stop using fossil fuels. Just stop oil is a terrible slip because it would kill billions of people. And we don't mean just stop oil in the sense of just switch it off, right? Just stop the financing of new oil and gas would be very good. Thank you very much. Mm-hmm. So in some respects, yes, there are end-to-end solutions, but look, we've just got to stop the financing of the new stuff. If we can't even stop the financing of new stuff, then pretty much everything else it's not moot, but it just makes so much sense just to keep it in the ground. When you look at the sheer amount of energetic and financial subsidies required to maintain and perpetuate the fossil fuel system, take a step back and you kind of try and look at it energetically or in terms of economics, you can just see how grossly dysfunctional it is as well, right? But for sure, there would have to be a significant redistribution of energy, materials, and wealth if we are to ensure that the rapid phase out of fossil fuels was not accompanied with large-scale social unrest, fuel poverty, And we have no end of examples of how well-intentioned climate policy produces kind of societal backlash in ways that should have been entirely understood and predicted and managed.
Can we go through some of those policies beyond, direct air capture and carbon capture and all this absolute nonsense? What are some of the other things that have been rolled out that on the surface you couldn't argue with, but the minute you scratch the surface, obviously have sort of second and third and fourth order effects?
A good example would be the EU directives on biofuels. So as a consequence of the EU really wanting to be progressive on its kind of scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, it wanted to do what it could to decarbonize road transport. And this is quite some time before the availability of large numbers of electric vehicles. And so biofuels could do that. For a while, I had a car that ran on waste vegetable oil, right? I used to go to a number of restaurants who fried a lot of food. And some of these places would literally throw it away, right? So you're kind of just using a waste resource. Well, there are very few cars that can eat raw vegetable oil, but you can use it as the feedstock for biodiesel. And so they created a whole bunch of financial incentives for biodiesel, right? And obviously that is then going to create incentives for vegetable oil. So then one response to that incentive was to increase palm oil manufacturing let's say, Malaysia, which accelerated the destruction of tropical rainforests. Mm-hmm. So when you did the assessment in terms of just the climate impacts, the amount of carbon that was released as a consequence of the deforestation to grow the palm oil to displace the hydrocarbon diesel, you would need to run that system for maybe hundreds of years before you even broke even, because there was this massive pulse of carbon emitted. So it's a kind of a classic kind of perverse incentive where you think you've got one kind of instrument, which is the price signal, and then some regulation and other bits and pieces to stimulate a fuel switch, ended up probably making it worse, right? And then there's other social examples, like the fuel protests in France as a consequence of increasing tax on diesel fuels was interpreted, rightly or wrongly, as in fact, probably quite rightly, as an unfair burden being placed on some of the countries, least able to afford it, right? It wasn't accompanied with maybe at the same time as a progressive taxation on carbon from consumption or private jet travel, or right? It was basically we're just going to whack a tax on, which in a uniform way is obviously very regressive. So there are there are all these ways to incentivize behaviors and global capital, which is still driven by fossil fuels, always finds a way, right? It always work out how to, right? So the only way you've got to do it is if you look at it as a stop and flow problem, there's too much carbon flowing into the atmosphere. You've got to directly work on the tap, right? And that might need a bit more muscular involvement from government or something, which will require like a mandate, hopefully from the democracies, right? We've got to collectively decide we want to do that. But you've got to work at that source. You've got to turn that tap down. Until you do that, then I think you're almost inventing solutions to perpetuate business as usual.
I think that's where I run up against the wall in my thinking, because I cannot see a way in which neo-imperial powers that are built off of the back of empire, that are still manifestly empire, I cannot see a way in which they give up access to a huge energy store. I mean, energy to the extent it's almost free, and which allows them to have so much muscle over the rest of the world and thus continue extracting resources and labor from the rest of the world. It is hard to imagine a future in which they reject their own access to that source of energy, essentially. And especially in a world in which military tensions are increasing, economic wars are being fought sort of in the shadows. There is a sense or an awareness of a global world order shifting and new alliances being formed, particularly around fossil fuel producing countries. As battle lines are being drawn, it seems almost impossible to imagine people walking away from an incredibly energy dense fuel source at that time, because to do so would be to welcome in a new age in which nations like the United States, the United Kingdom, the European nations, even China, India, I mean, what that would do to their own progression and standing in the world is kind of like a different kind of existential threat to the nation state.
It's certainly a fundamental rewiring of the world order or the global system. And there are certainly some nations that will do everything, like petrostates, do everything that they can to avoid the phase out of coal, oil and gas. That could be Russia. To a certain extent, that might be the United States. Or even Norway. Norway's a very progressive country in terms of its progress on its domestic emissions. Still one of the largest producers of gas and a really significant producer of oils, right? So happy to dig it up, extract it and sell it to somebody else, right? So these are sources of tremendous wealth. And one of the concerns around, like geopolitics is that rewiring of the world order. When you see China emerging as, the preeminent power with regards to renewable technologies and the critical minerals required, because over the last few decades, it's kind of vertically integrated the access to the mines, the production of resources, it's becoming kind of hegemonic in that respect. And that will be resisted. I mean, the European Union, United States are in the process of increasing import duties on Chinese electric cars, right? Because they're producing them much, much cheaper than European manufacturers can. And you can see other tensions arising from some of the renewable tech we will need for the rapid phase out. So, I mean, ultimately, we've got to understand the nation state's actions being motivated by their nation state interests.
I learned a little bit about the European car industry earlier this year, which helped provide like another angle for that problem, for that economic war. Because it was something I couldn't really wrap my head around, why there is still so much investment in automotive manufacturing in this part of the world. And why there isn't just, I mean, surely under the rules of capitalism, you just take the best good at the cheapest price, you know? Why is there all this resistance to it? And somebody explained to me, like, it is the only industry left. So much of our economy in Europe is made up on, or is made by the automotive industry, essentially. And it's the one thing that we still know how to do and still know how to do pretty well. And so we have to protect it with all our might because it's the one thing that we have to barter with, essentially, on the global political stage.
Yeah.
And that's really quite frightening.
Yeah, it feels almost as if, I mean, the arrangement was meant to be that China takes all our German cars, and in return we get, you know, all the cheap consumer goods, right? But that argument is used more generally for, I mean, in the UK, for the maintenance of our oil and gas industry, because so many jobs either directly related to the extraction, transport, refining, you know, or work of the industries. I mean, you're talking tens, hundreds of thousands of people, a significant chunk of the economy. And what we can't do is just delete those jobs.
Yeah.
Right? We did that in the 1980s with the closures of most of the UK's coal mines, right? For reasons. Yeah. I'm not saying they were motivated by climate at all, right? But a just transition, like climate justice, is meant to be, well, there will be certain industries that we don't want anymore, but it recognizes there's an awful lot of people who work in those industries. And if you're interested in, you know, sustainable livelihoods, good, decent, standard quality of life, then these people need to find other ways to make contributions to society. So a good example would be you're a gas boiler fitter, you retrain as a heat pump fitter, right? Now that's not easy, and that's not something that the market is going to solve. The market solution that would probably be destitution and then hoover them up as low paid labor for something else, right? So it's going to need a significant input from probably local and national government. And there needs to be a mandate for that. And I mean, I don't see any kind of discussions around that. I don't see any political appetite for that. I don't see any, I mean, certainly not this current government or the one before, or maybe even the one next. But these are the kind of things that we need to be talking about if we want to get serious about the rapid phase out.
We're coming up to the end, but I notice we still have about 10 minutes. And so I'd like to sneak in this conversation around what happens if we don't. Because on Planet Critical, there's quite a lot of people who have done different equations and different maths and say, you know, it's not looking good. You know, either energy systems are going to collapse by 2030, or there's not enough materials for a renewable economy, or you can't run this society on a renewable economy. And I invite people on to give their opinion, their insight, their foresight. And I would really, really like to hear yours, James. You seem very wise. I've obviously been following your work since we first spoke a few years ago. And even in the way that you answer all of these questions, everything that you say is highly systemized. And I think it's also important to give a perspective that isn't entirely doom and gloom, which you were very good at doing, a kind of smiling realist. So collapse. Do you think it will happen?
Smiling realist. My son loves a TV show called Smiling Friends. And if you haven't seen it, you should watch it. It's very funny in a kind of maybe almost apocalyptic way. Okay. It's a very, very strange and disturbing universe these people inhabit in Smiling Friends. I think I'll be at home there. So sorry, what's the question?
Do you think that, you know, human civilization as we know it will collapse? Or what does collapse look like? You know, just a small question.
All right, look, no one's got a crystal ball. It's not as if we can, through our telescopes, we've seen the asteroid approaching. I mean, we just don't know. There's vast amount of uncertainty. There's still a lot of uncertainty about what the climate is doing and will do as a consequence of our impacts. I'm very interested in the work on tipping points and biophysical systems, and then also cascading consequences on social systems. I think the risks of climate at the current level are being grossly underappreciated. They're being missed. There's a really dangerous blind spot when it comes to government assessments, pretty much everyone assessments. There's, we could be in an awful lot more danger than many people think, and anyone in anywhere near power thinks, right? So there's lots of reasons to be very pessimistic about what's going to happen. It's going to get warmer. Things are going to get worse. More people are going to suffer and die. More of the natural world is going to be destroyed. I just think that's the brutal reality. And to suggest otherwise, whilst it might be well motivated, I just don't think it's true or authentic. It's not a true and authentic representation of where we are right now. When it comes to collapse, when it comes to a significant fraction of the global population is going to be dead sometime maybe over this century or next, regions, nation states may collapse, increase in, armed conflict. There's no end of possibilities. We can kind of see possible futures branching out, and you could see lots of those ending up in really frightening and dystopian places. I suppose what I would say is that I've never seen any evidence, either kind of empirically in terms of, where things are going and how things are changing, or theoretically in terms of just maybe how the physics of this thing all works, that says that there's this one path or collection of paths that we're on, which unavoidably mean that this is where we're going to end up, right? I do think, and some of this is kind of hunch and sort of, like if we were doing this in a different format, we would call it an expert elicitation, where I invite lots of smart people to tell me what they think, and then we kind of synthesize in such a... I mean, that's what the planetary boundaries was and still is. It's a bunch of very smart people thinking, what do we think about biogeochemical cycles? Well, so it's not quantitative. There's no models around this. Yeah. And I think it's reasonable to conclude is the further we go along this path, that we can, in a very crude way, define as increasing carbon dioxide emissions, increasing destruction of the natural world, to a certain extent increasing population, but much more importantly, increasing energy and material consumption and consumerism. As long as those trends continue, you can see us moving further and further towards these kind of states where bad things will happen, but then also you get almost entrained into, like, you might describe it as a tipping point. I'm cautious about talking about social systems in the context of tipping points, because it's a lot more complicated than that. But you can imagine how societies might slip into or fall into kind of reinforcing traps, and right, those kind of risks, they just are increasing, right? But the thing is, they'll probably happen, or they could happen very abruptly and with essentially no warning. And so we'd only know they'd happen in hindsight, right? Which again is another risk, because if you're in a situation where these kind of risks are coming, they're effectively irreversible, they might give you no warning that they're happening, so you've got no ability to kind of mitigate them or avoid them, then surely you would do everything that you possibly could to be nowhere near, right? The whole point of the 1.5 warming was a guardrail. Well, at the moment, we're crashing past that with the deluded belief that at some point we'll just run back to safety when we've kind of looked over the side or something. And why we could do that? It seems to be driven by an ideology or worldview around growth, that through growth and innovation, we'll build the machines and technologies that we need to recover ourselves from safety. But they seriously propose we're going to do that sometime in the middle of this century, when there's escalating wildfires and devastating storms, when significant fraction, maybe the greatest movement of humans in all of history is happening, and increasing conflict. We're going to be spending trillions on decarbonizing. We're going to be spending trillions on adapting to existing and escalating impacts. We're going to be spending maybe even more on loss and damages. And at the same time, we're going to be deploying machines which effectively hack the entire climate. I mean, just come on. It's like insult your intelligence. So that's the serious proposal. But that is what is on the table, right? The best they can come up with now is some kind of overshoot into danger. But don't worry, somehow whether you call it capitalism or creativity and innovation and growth, will fix it. Or rather, it's our kids who are going to have to fix it, and their decisions.
If I may summarize.
Please do.
The debt could quickly get to a stage where it's too big to pay off. So we need to start chipping away at it immediately.
Yeah. It's a problem of space and time. There's vast inequalities. There's vast inequalities of who's responsible for the problem. And I'm in that fraction of humanity.
Me too.
And who's most exposed. But there's also this vast inequality in time. And again, it was my generation and previous generations. We had all the knowledge and understanding and science to conclude that we are dangerously interfering with the Earth system. And we knew exactly what we needed to do, right? And that would have been so much easier in the 1990s, right? Because we could have decided to have left it in the ground then, right? And undertake that transition, right? And we could have done it in a much smoother way, but we didn't, right? And now what we're proposing is that we'll play that debt forward and with some tremendous amounts of compound interest to our kids who now know, who not only need to decarbonize or, rapidly phase out coal, oil and gas and reform food systems, but then also fix the damage that we're producing now, that we're knowingly producing now.
Well, James, thank you so much for all of this. It is always you are a wealth of information, a treasure trove. And I do like how you talk about really, really dark things, but in a way that doesn't feel too dark. It still feels like, nope, this is the information that I need in order to make better decisions. And for that, I'm grateful. So thank you so much for coming on and giving us an overview of what to do in the face of 1.5 no longer being a realistic goal.
If I can brighten somebody's day by talking about the potential end of the world, then my job here is done.
My final question for you is, who would you like to platform?
Well, there's lots of people, right? We have spoken about a few. One that I haven't, and is Pasha Bell. So Pasha was in prison, but is no more, because they benefited from the new government's early release program, but they were in prison for 20 months. They were sentenced over the summer for their participation in the gantry protest for Just Stop Oil. Pasha is a very committed and passionate person striving for climate justice, but they are also a PhD student that researches some of the statistical properties of climate and climate change. And so they are not uniquely placed, but very, very well placed to talk about the science of climate change and just why they are so concerned, and then what that has meant to them in terms of translating it into action. And I think they would be great on the show because it's very good for old white guys like me to tell the world what it thinks. But I sit around and do nothing all day. Whereas people like Pasha are, yes, they're generating the knowledge, but then they actually do something about it.
Brilliant. I cannot wait to speak with them. James, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me on again. Thank you.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter inspired by each interview. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.